Hi, my name is Steve. I'm one of the dietitians at BHRUT, and this talk here is a nutritional talk on how we can improve your cardiac health through diet. I'll be presenting this talk with my colleague Shania, and some of the things we'll be talking about throughout the talk are risk factors for heart disease. We'll be looking at the importance of weight management. We'll be looking at the fats in the food that we eat and also the fats in our blood. We'll be talking about refined carbohydrates and limiting these in the foods that we eat. We'll be looking at cooking methods, food preparation, reading food labels, and the concept of a healthy, balanced diet. Risk factors for heart disease, quite often we split these up into two groups. We have the non-modifiable, which are things that are out of our control, and we have the modifiable, which are within our control. So let's look at some of these non-modifiable things, like age, for example. Risk of heart disease does increase with age. Gender, men are at a higher risk of heart disease than women. And of course, our genetics, our family history, they can also place us at a higher risk of heart disease compared to, say, somebody else. Now, even though these things may be out of our control, please don't feel that you're helpless when it comes to these things. It just means that you may have to emphasize things that you do have more control over and put more concentration on those and control those variables better than say, someone that doesn't have as much risk as you do. So let's look at some of these things that are within your control. Body weight, for example. The higher someone's body weight is, the more at risk of heart disease they are. Blood pressure, the higher someone's blood pressure is, the more at risk of heart disease they are. Same with cholesterol. Smoking and alcohol intake, the more you smoke, the more alcohol you consume, the higher risk of heart disease is. So again, there are things you can do to limit or stop those completely. There are various programs, and you can speak with various professionals and GP about that. When it comes to stress management is very, very important when it looks at your overall health, and that includes heart disease as well. So again, there are stress management programs that you can look into if you feel stress is affecting you. And if you don't know, it probably is. And then, of course, the bulk of our talk today is going to be on diet. So let's look at the body mass index. So the BMI, the body mass index, this is a ratio of your weight to your height. We've got some various ranges here that you can see on the slides, and the ideal range being between 20 and 25. If you're over 25, that increases your risk of heart disease because it means that proportionally for your height, you are carrying excess weight. Similarly, if your BMI is less than 18.5, that may also increase your risk of heart disease too. So the heart is a muscle, and the stronger that heart is, the more efficiently it can do its job. If you're underweight, that might mean that it's not strong enough and unable to pump enough blood and oxygen around the body, which can increase your risk of heart disease. So if you are underweight, we want to get you into that ideal range of 20 to 25. And of course, if you are overweight, we want to slowly start to bring that weight down, because that heart, again, has to pump blood around a bigger vessel if you are over 25 on your BMI. So getting that ideal range is optimal. Now, the BMI is a very good screening tool. Is it specific to everyone, and is it sensitive to everything? No, it's not, but it's a very good screening tool nonetheless, and should be used in conjunction with something else, which is what we call waist circumference. So, reason why waist circumference is so important is because the more fat you store around your waist can also influence your risk of heart disease too. Now, around your waist, you have your vital organs. You have your liver, you have your kidneys, you have your heart a little bit higher up, and you have your pancreas. And all of these organs, they have a role to play in regulating your blood sugar levels, your blood pressure, and the fats in your blood. So again, the more fat you store around these organs, the less efficiently they can do their job. So for example, the pancreas helps regulate your blood sugar levels, and the liver helps regulate your blood sugar and your blood fat levels. Your kidneys have a key role in regulating your blood pressure, and our heart, of course, is that pump that pumps the blood and oxygen around the body. The more fat stored around them, the less they can do their job, the less efficiently they can do their job. So when it comes to waist circumference, we've got some targets here which you can see on the slides for both men and for women. Again, these are very good screening tools, but they're not necessarily specific to everyone, but they are a good reference point to get started with. A more personal indicator might be using a waist circumference of less than half of your height. Okay, that's applicable for men and for women as well. And evidence shows if you can keep your waist circumference less than half of your height, you are in a good position then to prevent any further risk of heart disease or metabolic disease. Okay, and that measure works in both inches if you know your height in inches, and it also works in the metric system if you only know your height in centimeters. But less than half of your height measured at your belly button is a good target to aim for. So let's look at the blood lipids, the blood fats, okay? So we have two types of fats in our blood. We have cholesterol and we have triglycerides, okay? So cholesterol has certain functional and structural roles within the body, such as lining our cells, making hormones, transporting certain vitamins around the body. And there are good types of cholesterol and there are bad types of cholesterol, okay? Or I should say protective and harmful. So the different types of cholesterol are HDL, which are what we call our high density lipoproteins. They are protective for us. As I said, they're high densities, so they've got a bit of weight behind them. So as they're going through your system, they help mop up any excess bad or harmful cholesterol that's in our system as well. So the harmful cholesterol is what we call LDL cholesterol and VLDL cholesterol. And that's low density and very low density lipoproteins. Okay, and the reason why they are harmful is because they're low density, there's no weight behind them. And they just float throughout your bloodstream and they're going nowhere in a hurry and they accumulate around little corners and they find it very easy to embed into the blood vessels and that causes lots of swelling and over time that can cause a blockage as well. So what we want to do is try and minimize how much of the harmful LDL and VLDL cholesterol going through our system as possible and increase as much of the HDL, the good protective cholesterol going through our system as much as possible. Good news is we can do that with diet and we can do that with our lifestyle choices. And that's what some of this talk is about today, in particular the diets. So you may have been told by a professional that you may need to follow a cholesterol lowering diet. And it's at this point I'd just like to point out that a low cholesterol diet is quite different to a cholesterol lowering diet. And I'll explain this now. Cholesterol is present in some of the foods that we eat, but it's not the cholesterol in the foods that we eat that have much of an impact on our blood cholesterol levels. So for example, eggs are historically known to be high in cholesterol, same with shellfish and same with offal and organ meats. But when it comes to an egg, it will have something like 300 milligrams of cholesterol in it, which is like a 15th of a teaspoon, which is really tiny. Now, if you think about that diluted in your whole body, that's a minuscule amount, okay? But that's a high cholesterol food. So reducing the amount of eggs that you eat isn't going to have a significant impact on the cholesterol in your body. Not when our liver makes over 90% of the cholesterol that's circulating through our body anyway, okay? So you don't necessarily need to seek out low cholesterol foods, but what we do need to focus on is what the mainstay of this talk is, which is reducing the amount of fats in your food and triglycerides and refined carbohydrates in your food, because they do impact your cholesterol levels and your blood fat levels a lot more than the actual cholesterol in the food. Okay, so in short, you don't need to reduce your eggs to 1 a week. Okay, 1 a day would be absolutely fine. So, as I mentioned, it's the fats in the food that we eat that do have more of an impact on our cholesterol levels than the cholesterol in the food itself. So there are different types of fats in the food that we eat. We have saturated fats, which normally come from animal origin, and then we have unsaturated fats. Now, it's the saturated fats that raise our harmful cholesterol, the LDL cholesterol, the most. Okay, so we want to limit the amount of these saturated fats that are in our food. Where do we find these? So again, they're from animal products. So the obvious sources of these might be in things like butter and full-fat dairy. That might be in meats, and particularly the meat that you can see the white chunks of fat on the side of that meat. You might also find these in dripping, in ghee and clarified butters. So they're what I would call the obvious sources of saturated fats, so meat and dairy products. The not so obvious sources of these saturated fats may be in things like biscuits, cakes, chocolates, pies, puddings, pastries, those kind of foods, okay? And it's the butter in those foods that really hold the saturated fats, okay? But we don't always see the butter or the fat in the chocolate bar that we eat or the pastry that we're eating, okay? Whereas it's quite visible on the meat. So they're what I'd call the not so obvious choices. Next up, we have the healthy fats, and we have two types of these healthy fats. We have the monounsaturated fats or oils, and then we have the polyunsaturated fats and oils. Okay, so the monounsaturated fats, these are very good for us because what they tend to do is decrease the bad cholesterol and increase the good cholesterol. Okay, so that's exactly what we're trying to achieve when it comes to our blood levels. So decrease the bad and increase the good. Where can we find these? Well, we can typically find these in oils like vegetable oil and olive oil. So if you're going to add any oils to the food when you're cooking, these would be the favourable type of oils to cook, particularly for stove cooking as opposed to in the oven high temperature cooking. And then other sources of these monounsaturated fats might be nuts and seeds like walnuts and avocados, macadamia nuts, Brazil nuts, cashew nuts. They're really good sources of these monounsaturated fats, okay? And then just one final thought as well is that when you're looking for cooking oils, you may have heard rapeseed oil is a very, very good oil to use for cooking and salad dressings, etc. And it is. However, it can be expensive if you're specifically looking for a oil that says rapeseed oil on the front of the packaging. If you look at your standard vegetable oil and flip around the product and look at the ingredient section at the back, it will have on it main ingredient rapeseed oil, but it says vegetable oil on the front. So much cheaper than looking for the product that says rapeseed oil on the front. The standard vegetable oil is the same product. So the other type of healthy fats would be our polyunsaturated fats, okay? And the reason why these ones are healthy is because they also lower the bad cholesterol in the bloodstream. They can, however, in excess, also lower the good cholesterol too, the protective cholesterol. So these types of fats, we do want to be careful about how much of these we consume, okay? Now, the typical sources of these, plant-based sources of these would be nuts and seeds, such as peanuts and sesame seeds. And they're also found in oils, such as sunflower oils and corn oils, okay? They're added to a lot of products like dips and dressings as well. And because of that, be careful about how much of these you do consume because we want to try and maintain that good cholesterol in our bloodstream. Okay, so my advice would be if you're going to cook with your vegetable oils and your olive oils, and save these types of fats for the foods that already contain these, such as your dressings and your dips and things. Now, the other group of foods that are very rich in these polyunsaturated fats are fish, particularly oily fish. Okay, like salmon, sardines, pilchards, mackerel, and swordfish. Okay, we recommend having at least 1 to 2 portions of these oily fish a week for a good balance of health. And to get an adequate amount of these omega-3 fats, okay? Now, there are a third group of fats, which I'm yet to mention, which aren't natural in their occurrence, and these are what we call trans fats. Now, the reason why I say they're not natural in their occurrence is because they originated from vegetable oils, plant-based oils, but then during a chemical processing and treatments, they changed their chemical structure quite a bit. So they mimic, instead of being that oil, they mimic more of the saturated fats, solid at room temperature type of fats, okay? Now, these trans fats are also known as hydrogenated fats or partially hydrogenated oils or fats. Okay, and in particular, because we haven't evolved with these, because they're not naturally occurring, excuse me, our body doesn't quite know how to process them properly. So what ends up happening in our bloodstream is that it increases the bad cholesterol and it decreases the good cholesterol. So that's the counter opposite of what we're trying to achieve. So they are potentially very, very harmful and can increase your heart disease. Your risk of heart disease considerably. So what we want to do is try to identify these and where possible exclude these from our diet. So they're typically found in processed and manufactured products, such as pies, pastries, biscuits, breaded foods, certain cakes and sweets. They can be found in a lot of spreads as well. Now, in particular, it's the spreads that we should just consider for a minute. So in the past, if you have been told or you was under the impression that vegetable-based spreads were worse for you than a butter, which is a saturated fat, the reason why was because quite often they would put these hydrogenated oils in those spreads to make them taste more like butter and to be a bit more solid at room temperature. Okay, they would put those in those spreads, which can increase your risk of heart disease and of course can be worse for you than butter. However, if you can find a vegetable oil-based spread that doesn't contain these trans fats, that will be healthier for you than the butter because it will be richer in the polyunsaturated and the monounsaturated fats. Okay, now how do you find this? If you look at the ingredients section of that butter, or that spread that you're using, and not where it says the nutritional information, but where it says the ingredients, if you look at that part there, you'll be able to see if it says hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated oils, okay? And if it does, push that one aside and maybe look for the product that doesn't contain those, okay? Now, the other thing that I would say is, when it comes to these trans fats, is that they are also found in a lot of deep fried goods, okay? And it's, again, they pour the nice pure oil into the deep fat fryer, they heat it at high temperatures to cook something in the fast food outlets, they cool it down between cookings, and then they'll heat it and then cool it and then heat it and cool it. And that process repeats many times throughout the day, and sometimes I don't change the oil for 2, 3, 4, or 5 days. So again, that increases the amount of trans fats in there, and it's the temperature change that causes this change in its structure. So if you have a lot of deep fried foods in your diet, donuts, for example, or chips, for example, or deep fried chicken or fish, for example, if those things are common in your diet, you're probably going to be having a higher intake of these trans fats than you should. So again, look to limit how often that you have these foods, okay? And that's really what we're looking at in this talk. It's about balance, it's about moderation and frequency of these things. Have them, enjoy them when you have them, but don't have them as often as perhaps we'd like. So how do we reduce overall fat in our diet? Because as I've said, it's not the cholesterol in the foods that we're trying to reduce, it's the amounts of fats in the foods that we're trying to reduce. And in particular, it's the amounts of saturated and trans fats that we're trying to reduce. So, for example, when it comes to meats, if we was to trim off any visible or excess fat from the foods that we eat before we start eating them, and in some cases before we start cooking them, we're going to reduce the amount of saturated fats in the food. So again, that might mean that we remove the skins off of chicken, for example, before we start to cook it. And if we see any of that white, jelly, marbleized meat underneath the skin, we can just scoop that out. It might mean that if you like your pork chop or your sirloin steak, for example, that you cut the fat off before you cook it. And again, the reason why I say before you cook it is because a lot of that fat melts and it gets inside the body of the meat, and then we can't separate it. Okay, so where possible, remove the fat before cooking. Choosing leaner cuts of meat and poultry is another key thing you can do. So when it comes to mincemeats, for example, instead of perhaps just grabbing the first pack of mincemeat that you see off the shelf that might contain, let's say, 25% fats, looking for the one that might contain maybe 10% fat or 5% fat. Or even looking for an alternative type of mincemeat. So for example, turkey mince or chicken mince tends to be a little bit lower in fat than, say, lamb mince or pork mince. So swap in like for like, as well as looking at the labels is a good thing you can do. When it comes to the cuts of the chicken, we might be looking at the chicken breast as favourable when it comes to compared to the wings, the thighs or the drumsticks, because again, they contain a lot more fat within the meat itself and particularly under the skin too. Looking at low-fat cooking methods is another key thing that we can do. So grilling, boiling, steaming, poaching, microwaving, shallow frying, or even dry frying might be low-fat cooking methods compared to, say, deep frying. Okay, so vary your cooking methods quite a bit. And you can also consider using low-calorie cooking sprays as well. Some of these do contain artificial substances, which you may or may not like the idea of, or you might be looking at just a general oil-based cooking spray, which is natural oil, but because you're only spraying it, you can use a lot less of it compared to, say, a teaspoon. If you use it with, say, a pastry brush, you can make a couple of sprays of something, line the pan quite easily. When it comes to adding oils to foods, limiting the amount of oil that you add to food is another key thing that you can do. And I always use a measure of a teaspoon per person per portion as a good guide. So a teaspoon is around about 5 grams. It's a small amount, but again, it's enough to flavour the food, get the health benefits of the oil when it comes to your cholesterol levels, and also line the pan to stop the food sticking to it. So a teaspoon per person per portion is a good guide, rather than free pouring. Reading food labels, and specifically, which we're going to talk about a bit later on, but specifically looking for the foods that are low in fat would be another key thing that you can do. So again, limit the amount of fat that you're taking in overall, and not just during cooking and looking at ingredients, individual ingredients, but also when it comes to picking up that convenience food like lunchtime sandwich, for example, or even that lunchtime bag of crisps. And then the other thing I would say when it comes to these reduced fat ingredients is look to see how many of these you can stack in a meal or throughout the day, because all these differences, they do add up. So for example, if you're used to using full fat dairy milk with the blue top, switching to the semi-skimmed on the green top, if you use that milk throughout the day in your cereal, your tea and your coffee and maybe cooking, again, that's one small change that can go a long way. And if you couple that with a reduced fat cheese, which has 30% less fat than your full fat version, with that reduced fat milk, that's a stack that you've put in place. And again, if you use that with a reduced fat sauce and lean cuts of meat, again, and minimal added fat to the food, these things, they really do stack up to make a big difference. Not just at the end of the day, but at the end of the week, at the end of the month especially, at the end of the year definitely, and at the end of the next decade considerably. So these little changes, they do add up. And then one last thing is be aware of the hidden fats in some of the foods that we eat. Earlier I mentioned nuts and seeds. Now these are very, very helpful for you. These are very healthy foods, but they are very high in fats. And even in a small portion of nuts like this, you can easily, take in more fat than you intended, thinking that it's a healthy food. So portion size is a key thing. So limit your nuts to, say, a third of the size of your hands. Certainly no more than that on a frequent occurrence. So we've spoken about cholesterol. And then the other type of fat in our blood is what we call triglycerides. Now this is a type of fat that we use to make energy from, and it gets released from our liver in response to the foods that we eat. Now this can accumulate in our bloodstream if we're not using up enough energy, or we have too much in general coming in the form of fats. Now ideally what we want to be able to do throughout the day is burn fats at the same time as we burn sugar. And if we're taking in too much sugar, what our body tends to do is take care of the sugar instead of burning the fats. And they accumulate and they increase our risk of heart disease and also type 2 diabetes as well. So these triglycerides are naturally occurring in all, that they happen from all types of fats that we eat, but it's the quantity of these in our bloodstream which we need to be cautious about. But it's not as simple as just reducing the amount of fat in the food that we eat. It ties in quite closely with sugar and refined carbohydrates as well. So when we eat sugar, our blood sugar levels raise. And it's the same when we have refined carbohydrates. And what I mean by refined carbohydrates are white flour products. And the reason why these impact our blood sugar levels is because they get broken down very quickly, get digested very quickly, they get turned into sugar very quickly and released into the blood very quickly. So just like sugar, they increase our blood sugar levels. Now that's very, very dangerous for us in the long run. So our body is very efficient in the non-diabetic at trying to reduce down these blood sugar levels. So in its attempt to do that, what it tends to do is it stops burning fat, i.e. those triglycerides, and it concentrates on burning these blood sugars instead to bring them back down to the healthy range. That's good in terms of lowering your blood sugar levels, but it also means then that these triglycerides are still accumulating in your bloodstream. And if you have a frequent intake of sugars and refined carbohydrates throughout the day, then these triglycerides, they never get a chance to clear out of your system, and they do start to accumulate and accumulate. And that leads to further weight gain and in further increased risk of heart disease and diabetes. So what we want to do is find a way of managing them both. Now, if we start with sugar, we quite often refer to sugar as empty calories because providing, aside from energy, it provides nothing else to us. No vitamins, no minerals, doesn't fill us up, and that's the extent of it. It's kind of like petrol for us. As I say, it doesn't fill us up, so it makes us still remain hungry. So it's very easy to overeat it, looking for that hunger to stop. And then the other thing with it is because it raises those blood sugar levels and our body drops them down quite quickly afterwards, that cues hunger. So again, it's very easy for us to want to eat again, to bring them back up again, and then they drop again shortly after. And that sets a spiral up throughout the whole day of not just overeating these carbohydrates, but also snacking between meals as well, which we shouldn't necessarily need to do. Now, refined carbohydrates do exactly the same thing, a slightly slower scale, but they do very much the same thing. They get turned into sugar very quickly, raise the blood sugar levels and drop down very quickly. And that might mean that you crave that mid-morning snack at maybe 10 or 11 o'clock after that breakfast and before that lunch. And you might crave that mid-afternoon snack when you have that dip in concentration or tiredness at maybe 3 o'clock when that's in between your lunch and your evening meal. So these are two potential stacks that we don't necessarily need that may increase our risk of gaining weight further down the line. So if we can find a way of controlling our blood sugar levels better throughout the day, we can limit the ups and the downs, we can control our appetite a bit more, and we can control our weight a little bit more, that means, and our blood fat levels too. Now what we really want to do is find a type of food that we can have that's going to make us, fill us up a little bit, give us sustained energy throughout the day, but not trigger these hunger cues. And if we can have slow, subtle increases in our blood sugar and so subtle decreases in our blood sugar level throughout the day, it means that we can continue burning these fats in the background too, which is the way nature intended. So how do we reduce sugar in our diet? Well, let's look at sugary drinks first of all. Sugary drinks are a rich source of sugar in the average diet. So making a decision to either choose something that doesn't contain sugar, i.e. water, or sugar-free fizzy drinks if you're a fizzy drink drinker, such as your diet drinks, your light drinks, or anything that says no or sugar-free on the label. If going cold turkey on sugar isn't your thing, then maybe looking for the no added sugar drinks and juices might be a better approach. Doesn't mean they're sugar-free, but it means there's no extra sugar added to them if, say, it was a natural juice. And that way the sugar in it is a naturally occurring sugar anyway. When it comes to hot drinks like tea and coffee, maybe considering sweeteners might be an idea if you like that sweet taste in your tea and coffee. Alternatively, you might try a weaning approach, and instead of using 2 teaspoons of sugar in your cup of tea or coffee every time, you might want to cut down to 1 teaspoon of sugar in your tea and coffee, and then slowly over time reduce to maybe half a teaspoon or maybe even nothing altogether after a certain period of time. So you're weaning yourself off. And that's important because it gives your taste buds, your taste senses and preferences a time to adjust as well. And also, if you do exclude something from your diet that you typically have, your body almost goes into an element of shock and it wants something else to replace it. So you might be thinking you're doing a great thing, and in some ways you are, by not having that teaspoon or 2 of sugar in your tea and coffee. But if your body is not ready to not have that sugar, it might crave a biscuit instead. So at least when you're weaning yourself down, you're giving your body a chance to adapt with that. Another thing that you can do, which has grown in popularity recently, is sugar swaps. So if you look on the Change for Life websites, they've got some great ideas on swapping certain snacks for different snacks that contain so much less sugar, and certain drinks for different drinks that contain so much less sugar. So that's another key thing that you can do. So look at the foods that you think might be high in sugar, and if you can't identify those, again, we'll help you with the food labels a little bit later on, and then you can identify those foods, and then you can make the appropriate swaps. So refined carbohydrates, as I said, behave in your body in a very, very similar way to sugar. So again, what we want to do is look for those refined carbohydrates and see where we can swap them out for a better alternative. So again, the refined carbohydrates are your white flour products. Okay, so that might be your white flour breads. It may also be your white flour pastas. And any kind of breadcrumb containing or crisps kind of snack foods. So again, what we want to do is try and swap those out for a healthier alternative, and that's what we would call a whole grain carbohydrate instead. Okay, so the whole grain contains the fiber, it contains the husks, it means it's digested a lot more slowly. So again, that's going to slow the conversion of that food into a sugar, and it's going to slow the conversion of that sugar, or the release of that sugar, into your bloodstream. So the effect is going to be a lot more subtle on your blood sugar levels rather than the rapid increases and decreases from the refined carbohydrates. And that's what we're trying to do, that subtle increase, that subtle decrease. And instead of this happening over 2 hours, that may happen over 4 hours. Okay, and most importantly, we can burn those triglycerides at the same time. So again, at breakfast, examples might be whole grain or wholemeal or granary or seeded toasts. We might be looking at porridge oats, Weetabix, shredded wheats, those types of cereals, bran flakes. We might be looking at swapping white rices for whole grain rices and white pastas for whole grain pastas, and maybe looking at some other kind of grains as well, like a bulgur wheat or a couscous or quinoa, a different type of grain altogether instead of routinely going for the white pastas and the white rices. So next up, when we consider a healthy, balanced diet, is the topic of salt. So excess salt in the food that we eat can increase your risk of heart disease, and in particular blood pressure as well. And the reason why this is because salt really makes your body retain a lot more fluid. And your body is a certain size, and the more fluid it retains increases the pressure within it, like any vessel. And your body and your blood is no different. And your heart is the pump that needs to pump this fluid around the body. So the more fluid that it has to pump around the same space, the more pressure it's under. And that can cause structural changes to the heart itself, which we call left ventricular hypertrophy, which is the muscle in the heart grows a bit stronger than perhaps it needs to be. And it also means that the blood vessels themselves that the blood is pumping through, if they hit that at too much of a high pressure, they could potentially rupture and burst as well. So again, it's bad for your heart and it's also bad for your vessels. And that's what we want to try and keep under control. So limiting salt in the food that we eat is a key way that we can do this. Now, it's easier said than done. So the current guideline when it comes to salt is to limit our salt intake to no more than 6 grams a day. However, most of us take in around about 9 or more, so a good third more than what we should do. What makes this equally tricky is that about 85% of the salt that we take in on a daily basis is already in the foods that we typically use throughout the day before we have a chance to add any more to it or not. So really it means looking at the foods we typically use and making a conscious decision to either cook from fresh or look for lower salt alternatives. And because it's in so many foods, because it's a good stabilizer for the ingredients in the foods, and it increases shelf life, and of course it increases taste as well, manufacturers and food producers, they're not too keen on reducing the amount of salt that they put into the foods. So it's up to us to kind of lead the way on this one, and at least make some conscious health decisions too. Salt is commonly found in packet mixes, cooking sauces, condiments and certain marinades, processed meats, cured meats, smoked meats and fish as well. It's commonly found in. If we're looking at tinned foods and carton soups, for example, again, this is going to improve the shelf life of these foods, so they're high in those. And then we look at the savoury snacks, which you might be thinking are a little bit more obvious, things like your nuts and your crisps and your popcorns, your crisp breads, for example. These all tend to be very high in salt, and you can taste these ones. They're probably the obvious ones. But it's the other things that we kind of use for more of a convenience point of view, such as the cooking sauces and the table mixes, packet mixes. They're the things that probably do need a little bit more prior planning if we're going to look to reduce our intake of those. Of course, the other rich source of salts in the foods are from packaged goods, takeaways and fast food outlets as well. And again, we go to these because we like the flavours of these foods, of course, but also for convenience too. So when it comes to salt, it's not just a taste-led thing, it's very much a convenience and a lifestyle-led thing as well. So it is very hard to try and reduce the amount of salt in our foods. It takes a real conscious effort. Some helpful things that you can do to start with, of course, would be to maybe reduce your intake of the processed meats, things like burgers, sausages, cured meats, sandwich meats, and fish as well, cured fish, and see what alternatives you can use. So, for example, if you use a tinned tuna that's tinned in brine, maybe looking for the one that's tinned in spring water. So you're swapping a like for like, so you can still maintain the convenience there. If you're looking at burgers and sausages, for example, either reducing the frequency that you have these might be a good idea and looking to have something else that doesn't contain the salts, or maybe looking for a product that has 30% less salt than the original might be another like-for-like way of doing it. Or maybe having 2 or 3 meat-free days a week and looking to bring in something else instead might be a good idea. So that way you're not substituting that high salt food for a different high salt food instead. Cooking as much from fresh is one of the best things that you can do. So instead of opening that jar of tomato-based sauce for your pasta, for example, you might think it takes me just as much time to blend up 4 or 5 or 6 tomatoes in a blender, add some herbs and some lemon juice to it instead, as opening the jar. There's not much of a price difference in many cases, and while you're in front of the stove waiting for your water to boil for your pasta, you can quite easily be blending up some tomatoes and chucking it in a pan as well. So again, it's just a change in behaviour there that can add up to make a big difference over time. Maybe reducing the frequency of takeaways and fast foods that you have as well might be another key thing. If you're routinely having 2 or 3 a week, maybe even cutting down to 1 a week might be a huge step for you. And the same with sandwiches and things, rather than always buying the sandwich off the shelf and the packet of crisps that comes with it. Maybe making your own sandwiches at home might be a better way of staying in control of the amount of salt that you're having and the foods that you're eating, and then maybe swapping it out for a piece of fruit or something instead of the packet of crisps every time, and maybe doing the crisps every other time. Alcohol would be the next, dare I say, nutrient that we should discuss in the healthy balanced diet. Contrary to popular belief, alcohol does not reduce our risk of heart disease in any way or shape or form. There are certain elements that are in certain compounds that are in alcohol-containing drinks that can reduce it, but they're also the same things that are in fruits anyway. So alcohol itself doesn't do anything to reduce our risk of heart disease and reduce our cholesterol. In fact, what it does do is increase our triglycerides that are going through our system, so it can actually increase your risk of heart disease, particularly when it's drank in excess as well. When we talk about excess, the guideline has changed in recent years. The guideline is for men and women to have no more than 14 units a week, so it's exactly the same. Once we did think and give men a little bit more of an allowance than women, but that has changed. It's 14 units, no more than 14 units for both. And then the other part of the guideline is really to balance the alcohol out throughout the week, ensuring we have at least 2 to 3 days off a week and avoid binge drinking as well. Now, when it comes to alcohol, things to remember is that it's very rich in calories, has more calories on a gram for gram basis than carbohydrate and sugar does. And again, that's one of the reasons why it does increase your triglyceride levels. And then the other thing is, because it is a toxin, our body wants to get rid of it as quickly as possible. So it really places that on the hierarchy of importance and tries to detoxify your body from the alcohol instead of burning the sugar, which means the blood sugar levels rise in your system. And it does that instead of taking care of the triglycerides. So it also means the triglycerides start to accumulate in your system. So the more frequently that you have alcohol, and certainly the more quantity of alcohol you have, the more your blood sugar levels and triglyceride levels are likely to raise. As I said before, alcohol is rich in calories in itself. What it does also do is promote appetite too. So it might make you snack on something that perhaps you didn't want on. I would say you didn't want, but perhaps you didn't need. It does stimulate your appetite. And then the other thing that it also does is impair good judgment and decision making. So, if you was feeling a little bit peckish, reaching for an apple in the middle of a night of drinking is probably the last thing you'll do, and you'll probably go for something a little bit more energy rich instead. So again, it can impair our judgment and our healthful behaviours. When it comes to units, I'll just point out that a unit would be a small glass of wine, 125 ml. A small shot of spirit, which is 25 ml, not the European measures that we so commonly have in the pubs and restaurants these days. And it might be a half a pint of a regular strength beer, not your strong stuff. Okay, so on to some more protective stuff for us. So we've got fibre to discuss next. So fibre is what we call a cardioprotective nutrient. It's good for your bowels, of course, as it is for your heart as well. Quite often we associate fibre with our bowels, but it is cardioprotective too. Now, there are two different types of fibre. You have your soluble fibre, which is stuff that we can dissolve, and we have your insoluble fibre, which is your roughage. And it's the roughage that's good for your bowels, it clears you out like a pipe. But it's the soluble stuff that's particularly interesting for heart disease, because what this does is it dissolves into like a gel-like substance, and it lines your bowels, and it stops you from absorbing some of that cholesterol in the food that you eat and some of the cholesterol that your body recycles when you're eating as well. So it can reduce the amount of cholesterol circulation through your system. So when it comes to fibre, we set a target of aiming for roughly 30 grams a day or more. Again, reading food labels will help you find out how much fibre you are having and give you some target to aim for. But one thing I will point out at this point is, if you don't think you have a lot of fibre in your diet, aim to increase it slowly. You don't want to shock your system because it might clog you up. And then the other thing it would be to increase your fluid intake at the same time as you gradually increase your fibre intake too, because that will help the transit go through. Now, fibre slows the transit of food through your system, in particular through your stomach, so it will fill you up for longer if you have fibre-containing foods. And the more of these fibre-containing foods that you have, the more of these they're present in the whole grain foods. So again, that might limit the amount of the refined carbohydrates we're having, because we're swapping them for the whole grain versions instead. So your whole grain pastas, rices, your root vegetables, particularly with the skins on, and then your nuts and your seeds and things like that, and your bran flakes and your porridge oats. And one further thing I'll point out is, because we're always looking for that quick cheat, is that there's no real benefit to heart disease having fibre, supplementing with fibre husks, than actually having fibre-rich foods instead. Okay, it might bulk out your stools if you have the husks, so it's good for your bowels perhaps, but not necessarily is going to lower your risk of heart disease. So having the whole grain food themselves is far better for you. It's cheaper and it's more natural. And on the subject of small little cheats, next up we have these things called plant sterols. Now, these are naturally occurring compounds that are in foods, particularly plant-based foods. And what these do is they have a similar chemical structure to cholesterol, and they stop your body, or can stop your body, from absorbing much of the cholesterol in the food that you eat, and also that your body recycles when you are eating and digesting food. And it absorbs these things instead. And because it does this instead, it can reduce the cholesterol going through your system. A lot of food processors and manufacturers have cottoned onto this, and they've started to make these designer goods that they've put these plant stanols and sterols in, and marketed them that they can improve your cardiovascular health. The truth be told is that there's, even though they may have an impact on reducing your cholesterol levels, when it comes to translating that to your risk of heart disease, there's no evidence to say it reduces your risk of heart disease. And all of these things that are in these designer products can be found in a healthy, balanced diet anyway, such as a diet adequate in fruits and rich in vegetables, and your whole grain foods, nuts and seeds as well. So again, you won't necessarily need to look for the products that have these stanols and sterols advertised all over them, because they do need to be used in high amounts in a certain quantity of time and to the manufacturer's instructions, and we have no real way of knowing how precise and accurate that information actually is anyway. So what is this healthy, balanced diet that I keep talking about? Well, quite often we refer to the Eat Well plate, or the Eat Well guide, as a representation of what a healthy, balanced diet should look like. If you look at the slide here, you can see these different colours and different compartments. And this really is what our diet should look like. Not every meal, so even though it is on a plate, it shouldn't necessarily be every meal. But if at the end of the day, we can say, oh, I think I've had something that looks something like this, then we're going in the right direction. Now, the two biggest sections you can see straight away are the fruits and the vegetable section, and then that yellow carbohydrate section. So let's work our way around this plate. So the fruits and the vegetable section, our target as a nation is to aim for at least 5 portions of fruits and vegetables a day. Okay, we should probably consider the divide of fruit and vegetables here as well. For example, we wouldn't recommend having just 5 portions of vegetables and 5 portions of fruit and no vegetables, because of the sugar that's in these fruits. Because again, that can still impact your blood sugar levels overall. But if you can divide them up into having maybe no more than 2 bits of fruit and maybe 3 or more bits of vegetables throughout the day, then that's a good healthy divide. The sugar in the vegetables is a lot more slowly digested and absorbed and released than the sugar in fruit is. Okay, so aiming for more vegetables than fruit is a good general rule. What's a portion? A portion would be about 80 grams for the mathematicians out there, or something round about the size of the palm of your hands, and on a single layer. So even though you can balance a whole pineapple there, a single slice would suffice. When it comes to other sources of vegetables and fruits throughout the day, in our diet, fruit juice still counts as one of our portions of fruits, but by a portion we mean no more than 150 ml, which is about that much in a glass, and only letting that contribute to 1 portion of your fruit or vegetables a day, certainly having no more because of the sugar that's in it. Ketchup apparently can contribute towards our fruits and vegetables. The juice in baked beans can contribute towards our fruit and vegetable intake. So again, we can look for other sources, not just the whole fruits and vegetables. The whole fruit is definitely preferred because of the fibre that it contains. And if you can have fruits and vegetables that contain the skin, again, that's going to be more beneficial because it will fill you up for longer and contain more fibre too. Frozen vegetables are just as good, and in many cases better than fresh vegetables too, in the instance that they've been shipped around the world. Because if they've been frozen within an hour or two of being picked, they're going to retain a lot more of their nutrients if it's bananas, let's say, which we don't grow in this country. And tinned vegetables and fruits can also contribute well to our fruit and vegetable intake too. What I would say though, if we're looking at tinned fruits, is to look for the ones that are tinned in their own juice as opposed to the ones tinned in syrup, because of the excess sugar, and to drain off as much of that juice as possible to again reduce the amount of sugar that we contain. And when it comes to vegetables, where possible, looking for ones that aren't soaked in too much brine, and if they are, then to rinse them out thoroughly before you put them into your food to reduce the amount of salt that you're taking overall as well. Let's skip round to this yellow section now, so the carbohydrate section. And that word carbohydrate is quite often misunderstood. But let's just address carbohydrate as an umbrella term for those 3 different types of carbohydrates that we've mentioned so far. And it is an umbrella term for sugar, refined carbohydrates, and whole grain, starchy, healthy carbohydrates. And that's really what we want to see in that yellow portion of your diet. That's the whole grain, healthy, starchy carbohydrates. So again, your whole grain, wholemeal, seeded or grated granary breads, your wholemeal or whole grain pastas and rices, and then when it comes to cereals, we'll be looking at your porridge oats, your Weetabix, your shredded wheats, your bran flakes. Okay, they're really what we want to see in each of your meals throughout the day. Okay, that's going to balance your blood sugar levels, help maintain your fiber, help control your cholesterol, help burn those triglycerides. There are so many healthy benefits to having that carbohydrate-based diet, small portions at every meal. Okay, let's move around to the blue section next, which is our dairy section. So again, these foods are rich in protein, which is good for us, rich in calcium, which is good for us. Some of the foods are rich in vitamin D as well, which is good for us. But these foods, they can have the potential to be very high in the saturated fat because these are from animal products, okay? So again, looking to see what you can do to reduce the amount of fat in the foods that you eat is the key thing we're looking at. And that might mean swapping from that blue top milk to that green top milk. It might be using that reduced fat cheese as opposed to that full fat cheese. It might be looking for that low fat cheese as compared to a full fat cheese. So depending on what you're having, you might want to experiment with your cheeses. It might be looking for a low calorie yogurt as opposed to a full fat yogurt. And on the subject of low fat and reduced, reduced means 30% less than the original product, and that's cross-board if we're talking about fats, sugars or salts, okay? So the more of these reduced fat products you can bring into your daily diet, as I mentioned earlier, the more you can stack up and get the benefit from, okay? But also the thing to be careful of is that when we use a product that's low in fats, for example, they haven't substituted the fat for sugar instead, okay? Because quite often a lot of the manufacturers, they do that. They reduce one and increase the other for taste purposes. And it might be reducing fat and replacing it with sugar, or it might be vice versa. So again, looking at your food labels is a key thing to try and get into the habit of doing. And the good thing is once you've done this once or twice, you know the products that you're choosing are going to be the healthful ones. You won't need to do it every single time you go shopping. You'll develop a short list of things that you know automatically are the healthier option. So when it comes to yogurts, going for a low calorie yogurt will give you peace of mind to know that it's low in calories and low in fats and low in sugar, rather than low in one and high in the other, because it's low in calories across the board. Okay. Moving on to that next section would be our other high protein foods. That includes our meats, our fish, and our pulses and our grains and our eggs. So again, this can have the potential to be high in fats, and particularly for the animal products, the saturated fats, which we want to reduce. So as I mentioned earlier, a bit of revision all around here, reducing the amount of visible fat that you're taking, so cutting off the visible fat before you cook it in some cases, and certainly before you eat it, and looking for those lower fat cut meats, so maybe looking for the fillet as opposed to the rump if we're looking at steaks, and it might be cutting the visible fat off the pork chop or the sirloin instead of eating it. And again, for the chicken breast, for the chicken, it might be better going for the breast as opposed to the wings, the thighs, or the drumsticks. Other sources of protein would be pulses and beans as well. And now these foods are very, very high in protein, and they're plant-based foods. They won't contain anywhere near as much saturated fat as animal-based fats, okay? And if you can mix certain combinations of these, we can still get adequate protein in our diet. And even if you mixed these in with low-fat meats, you can have a very, very filling high-protein meal there. And that will probably stop you from wanting to snack several hours later as well due to hunger. The more of these you can bring into your diet, the more benefit you're going to get, because these foods also are very high in fiber too. And then the other food that's in this section would be the eggs. So again, as I said earlier, we don't necessarily need to limit to 2 eggs a week. An egg a day or the equivalent is absolutely fine. Focus on the cooking methods more. So again, instead of routinely frying that egg, maybe using a low calorie cooking spray, or looking to boil it or poach it or do it in the microwave without any added extra fat, might be another thing you can do to enjoy the egg still without the concern that it's going to impact your cholesterol levels. And even if you wanted 2 eggs 3 times a week instead of 1 egg a day, that's still absolutely fine. And then the last one, when it comes to fish, 1 to 2 portions a week of the oily fish is plenty to give you all the benefits of the omega-3s in terms of your cholesterol levels and your overall health, without taking in too many of those polyunsaturated fats that it might impact your good cholesterol levels. And then that last little slither that I missed out on that is what we call is our high fat ingredients. So that would be like our oils and our high fat spreads. So of course they do play an important part on anyone's diet, just like they do in one's sandwich. But you can see how small that amount is there. So if we think about things like oils, spreads, and even mayonnaise and mayonnaise-based goods, we would kind of put that in that section there. So enjoy these foods, use them sparingly, but see where possible what you can do to reduce the amount that you use. So again, whether that's cooking sprays or using a combination of a cooking spray and a pastry brush, or looking for a reduced fat version of that mayonnaise or coleslaw, for example. But seeing what you can do to reduce that amount, but still recognize that it is important and it will still contribute to your overall diet. So after the fats and oils, you're probably thinking, well, what are those biscuits and cakes and crisps things in the corner? He hasn't mentioned those yet. Well, they're foods that really we should enjoy on an occasional basis. They probably keep us sane as well, because we don't want this diet to be a punishment. We want it to be enjoyable. What we would say with these foods is enjoy them when we have them. Not necessarily seeking out the healthiest choices of these, because if we want them, we probably want them for a specific reason, be it we want a sugar hit or a salt hit. So enjoy them when you do have them, but try and focus on the frequency that you have them. And if you notice that you're having these maybe every day, then maybe cutting down to every other day is a really, really good first step, because that's a 50% reduction. And again, if you think, okay, well, maybe I think that's a little bit too much, maybe cutting them down to every third day. So again, swapping them out for a piece of fruit, for example, might be a good alternative, or even a low-calorie yogurt might be a good alternative. But focus on the frequency that you have these things. But remember, this diet is to be enjoyed, so don't necessarily exclude them from your diet if you don't want them to, but just focus on the frequency and the portion size that you do have them in. And if we're going to talk about a balanced diet, of course, fluid is one of the important components of a balanced diet too. What we say to people is, as a general guide, to aim for about 2 litres of fluid a day, which is about 8 cups, 200 ml cups or so of fluid a day. A good indicator to see if you're drinking enough is the colour of your urine. If it's particularly concentrated and it smells strongly, that might be a sign that you're not drinking enough fluid. So sensible thing to do is up it by 1 or 2 cups a day until you kind of reach that straw, non-offensive smelling type of urine, as a general guide. But for most people, 2 litres of fluid a day is adequate. If you're huge into your sports and your physical activity, then again, you might need a little bit more. But for most of us, 2 litres, 8 cups is a good starting point. And then just remembering that we get some fluid from the food that we eat too. So if you think I only managed 3 cups or 4 cups and 8 is a mile away, don't necessarily stress. If your urine's okay, that means the balance between the foods that you're eating and the fluid that you're taking in is going to be in balance. And your teas and your coffees, they do contribute to your fluid intake as well. Okay, so there's a little bit of peace of mind there too. So food labels is what we've been talking about in little drips and drabs throughout the talk so far. Now this really is going to give you a lot of information that you can use to decide whether a product that you're about to buy is going to be as healthy as you think it is, and hopefully influence your decision one way or another whether you want to buy it. The traffic light system is something that's used more and more because of its ease of understanding. And what it really shows you is it shows you, when we look at sugars, fats, saturated fats and salts, what foods may be high, and they will be highlighted red, what might be medium, so used with caution, which might be highlighted amber, and then what might be green, as if to say, okay, these foods are great, go ahead. So in general, it's a very good, easy use guide. It's not 100% perfect, but it's a good guide to help you influence your decisions. The more of these foods that you can buy containing green stroke amber, as opposed to amber stroke red, the better you're going to be in terms of your health and the more informed you're going to be in terms of the foods that you're eating. So try to look for those foods. More importantly, look at the numbers that are on those as well, because the numbers are going to help you make a comparison from one food to another that perhaps doesn't have this traffic light system on it. Now you can also get little cards that you can keep in your wallet that the British Heart Foundation produce too. So again, when you are out and you are making purchases, you can use these little cards to compare against the nutritional information on the back of that food product to see if it fits the bill or not, even if it doesn't have this traffic light system on the front of it. And the other thing to consider as well is that some foods don't quite fall into a green cross the board section of this traffic light system. So for example, if you're going to buy an olive oil, which I've already said so many times is a very healthy oil for you, it's going to be red in fat because it is a fat. So it's going to be very high in fats, and it's going to be green in sugar. But don't be put off it because it is high in fats, because that's exactly what the product is. So some foods, they don't fall into this category. But if you can say 90% of the foods that you buy do fall into the green stroke amber, then that's going to be a good thing. Okay, so look for those and look to see what swaps you can make with your food choices to get more of these green stroke ambers in, as opposed to the reds or the red stroke ambers. And it is balanced throughout the day what we're looking for. Now, the information on these traffic light systems, I'll just quickly point out, quite often is used as a reference guide per 100 grams. Okay, so per 100 grams of a food product. We don't necessarily always eat 100 grams of that food, but as a percentage based, it's good. So just be sure that when you're looking at the food label, you are interpreting it correct, whether it's a portion, which it will say on the traffic light system on the front, or per 100 grams, which it will probably have on the back. Okay, as long as you know what you're looking for. But in general, as long as it's green stroke amber, you know you're going in the right direction, whatever the portion size or quantity is. Okay. So a little bit of revision here in what is a healthy balanced diet. First of all, what we're looking for is a regular balanced meal pattern, something that's going to increase your blood sugar levels subtly, sustain them over time, lower them down slowly over time, and repeat 2 or 3 times throughout the day, such as breakfast, lunch and dinner, avoiding the need to necessarily snack between meals when we don't need to, if we're conscious about taking in extra calories and managing our weight. What we really want to do is look to reduce excess refined carbohydrates and excess sugars in our diets as much as possible because of the influence it does have on our health. We want to look to reduce saturated fats and in particular those trans fats in our diet as well. See what you can do to identify them, and then we're in a position to be able to reduce them. Okay. Increase our proportion of fruits and vegetables in our diet, making sure that more than half comes from vegetables compared to the fruits. And then reducing the amount of sugar and salt in our diet, and alcohol would be the other key things to do. Now, it all sounds easier said than done, and it might be a lot of information for you all to take in. But if you take it on a meal by meal basis and work your way through, this stuff becomes a lot bit easier to digest. Most of us, we do have a very similar eating pattern from one day to the next. So if we can make a change and a change for the better, if we can make it and stick to it, it's easier to sustain. And once we've decided what change we need to make, again, it's easier to continue because we've identified what was bad about it, we've put something good in place, and then we can just roll with it. We are creatures of habit. And again, most of us, when it comes to our evening meals, we probably run off the same evening meal on a 2-week cycle every 2 weeks anyway. So again, if you can pick one of those meals at a time and say, okay, I'm going to look to see what I can do to overhaul this meal and make it more healthy as possible, such as swapping the mincemeat for the reduced fat mincemeat and taking care of my cooking methods, reducing extra added oils while I am cooking, putting more vegetables in it, maybe cooking that rice from fresh instead of using a packet mix, and pick one meal at a time and focus on that one, and then the next week pick a different meal. We can snowball and we can get to where we need to be, but the key thing is to take it slowly. If you try and change too much too soon, it's virtually impossible to sustain, but the more of those slow baby steps we can make, the more of a chance we've got of sustaining them. And where do we start with it all? Well, I think the best thing to do is look at the one thing that's personal to you that you could change that's going to make the biggest difference overall. And if it's swapping the milk, for example, for semi-skimmed milk as opposed to the full fat milk, or skimmed milk instead of the full fat milk, or it's for you is taking the sugar out of your tea and coffee and using a sweetener, or weaning down, or going cold turkey, whatever the biggest thing that's going to make a difference to you is, identify that one, start there, and then once you've nailed that one, move on to the next one that's going to make the biggest difference, and then the next one that's going to make a biggest difference. Because that's what we want. We want this thing to become automatic so you don't have to consciously think about it every single day. And in the end, it might take several weeks, several months, even if it takes several years, we'll get to where we need to be, but just slowly, slowly, slowly. And if we can do it without it feeling like punishment, then that's a good thing. And then if there are further sources of information that you would like to read up on, the British Heart Foundation, they provide endless resources for us, really usable information for patients to use, usable things like those cards that I mentioned, information booklets. In fact, everything I've said you'll be able to find on their guides and on their websites. Really good, valuable resource there. And of course, there's the NHS websites and the Heart UK websites as well. So best of luck with everything. I hope you've enjoyed the talk today, and good luck going forward.